Good afternoon. Welcome to the Center for Free Expression's In Conversation event today that's going to be looking at a very old problem from the perspective of an exciting and very interesting new book, and the subject is anti-Semitism. I'm Jim Turk, and this is the Center for Free Expression. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the territory in which I'm speaking to you today is the traditional home of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I'd also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaties with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. I would also like to thank the co-sponsor for today's conversation, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, the Institute for the Humanities at Simon Fraser University, and PEN Canada. We greatly appreciate your sponsorship of this event. Our featured guest today is Philip Slayton. Philip is from Winnipeg. He was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. He's had a very interesting career. He was a professor of law at McGill, dean of law at the University of Western Ontario, and then he went into private practice with a major Canadian law firm in Toronto, where he worked on many of the largest corporate and commercial transactions at the time. He then became an author. He's written 8 books, and the most recent, which is the subject of today's conversation, is titled Antisemitism, an Ancient Hatred in the Age of Identity Politics. Along the way, Philip has been a Woodrow Wilson Fellow, president of the Canadian Rhodes Scholars Foundation, a member of the Board of Governors of Sheridan College, and president of PEN Canada. Welcome, Philip.
Thank you, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we're delighted that you are here. In conversation today with Philip will be hopefully, and I'll explain that in a minute, Samir Gandesha. Samir is professor and director of the Institute for the Humanities at Simon Fraser University. He's the author and editor of a number of books. The most recent is Spectres of Fascism, Historical, Theoretical, and International Perspectives. Samir is also a public intellectual who writes for the Vancouver Sun, the Globe and Mail, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Open Democracy, Canadian Dimension, and others. And he has been a visiting professor at universities in China, Germany, and Brazil. He's in Mexico today and tells me that his internet connection at the hotel he's in is off and on. So we're hoping, Samir, that it's on right now. Welcome.
He is not in here.
I'm afraid we've just lost him. Okay, well, I'd like to explain to the audience, and welcome to all of you, that we're going to have the conversation with Philip. I'll have it with him if Samir isn't able to rejoin us. And during that conversation, we want to work toward a point where the audience will be engaged with us in the conversation. So if you look at the bottom of your screen on your computer, you'll see a Q&A button. So if during the conversation, as Philip is talking, a question comes to mind that you would like to ask him or an issue you'd like to address with him, just click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and write out the question that you would like to pose. And do that as you hear it. Don't wait till we turn to the audience for questions. And when we do turn to the audience, Ange Holmes, who's the coordinator of the Center for Free Expression, will be monitoring the Q&A and will ask the questions as they come in to Philip. So we really hope that members of the audience will be engaged with the issues, and we'll have questions and issues they would like to raise with our guest. So please take advantage of that feature of our program. So given that Samir isn't here, Philip, you'll have to put up with me as your interlocutor, as it were. Perhaps
just fine, Jim.
So could we begin, Philip, with you telling us just a little bit about what brought about you deciding to write a book on anti-Semitism at this point, and sort of an overview of what you tried to do in the book?
Sure. Well, Jim, the story is not very interesting or dramatic. As I mentioned in the introduction to the book, I one day had a call from a publisher who said, hey, somebody I knew, I'd served on the PEN Canada board with him, who said, hey, I think you should write a book about anti-Semitism. You're the guy, was the way he put it.
Okay.
I didn't think I was the guy. I wasn't initially terribly attracted to the idea for various reasons. But as I thought about it subsequently, I thought, well, you know what? This is a pretty interesting subject in all kinds of ways, and maybe I will take a run at it. So that was the genesis of it. Not very, it wasn't a great mission of mine to do this, but it was something that kind of was dumped in my lap, but I took it. So that was the genesis of, and by the way, it was during the pandemic when we were all looking around for things to do that we could do from home easily, right? As I say in the book, what could be more diverting from a pandemic than anti-Semitism? So, okay, so then the question was, well, what am I going to say about it? I mean, lots and lots of people for a long, long time have written about anti-Semitism in all kinds of ways. What new thing, if anything, could I say? What new perspective could I adopt? And it occurred to me that really the world has changed so much in recent times in all kinds of ways that maybe anti-Semitism needed to be reinterpreted or viewed again through a new lens. In what's happened? Well, of course, the Holocaust was an extraordinarily dramatic and important event in the long history of the Jews, the creation of the state of Israel following the Holocaust, likewise. But now today we face populism, we face various kinds of threats to democracy, we face the rise of social media, we face an increasing number of conspiracy theories, and of course, above all else, we face this tremendous drive in a very important way of identity politics. So I tried to kind of view this very old hatred, as this book, the subtitle of the book indicates, in a somewhat different way, through the prism of the modern age, and see what new could be said about it.
At the beginning of the book, you talk about, I think, a good start, which is a good starting point for us, about what's the basis of anti-Semitism now? What have been the bases over time, and what do you see the basis of anti-Semitism now? Okay,
well, I would answer that in two parts. I mean, the first part is kind of basic human nature. I quote, I think, the essayist Theodore Hazlitt in the book, who said, everybody needs someone to hate. It seems to me, regrettable as it is, that the desire to hate, the proclivity to hate, seems to be embedded in most people. And then the question is, well, who are you going to hate, right? Who's convenient? Who's at hand to be an object of your hatred? So I think you have to begin with human nature, human psychology. But then beyond that, again, as I discuss in the book, the original basis, I think, of anti-Semitism was religious. If you practiced Judaism, you were Jewish as a result. And people, for example, the Spanish in the 15th century, didn't like that. But then it's shifted from religion to race. Why? Because you can change your religion, you can convert, as indeed many Jews, in, let's take Spain in the 15th century, did in order to avoid anti-Semitism.
Right.
But you can change your race. And of course, the epitome of anti-Semitism, the racial hatred as opposed to religious hatred, was Nazi Germany. It was all about bloodlines. You can't change your bloodlines. Whatever you say, whatever you do, you can't change them. But now some people, some theorists, some academics now say that anti-Semitism has entered a third phase, which is really largely ideological. What counts is not what religion you practice. What counts is not your bloodline. What counts is what you think, what positions you take on various issues, and in particular, what position you take on Israel, what position you take on Zionism, what position you take on various Israeli policies. And that's where, of course, the lines between anti-Semitism and Zionism and anti-Zionism become very blurred, which is very regrettable.
Yes, I mean, we've seen that. There have been various attempts to define what anti-Semitism is, and you talk about them in the book. And we had a panel a year or two ago, probably the most popular panel we've had and the most contentious, was on the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism. Yes. You talk about that. What are your thoughts on that definition?
Well, I think it's a very poor piece of work, if I can put it that way. It is vague, it's confused, it's flabby, it's not balanced. You know, it's one of those kinds of so-called, it's not even, shouldn't even be called a definition. It's not a definition, but it's one of those definitions in quotation marks that anybody can take out of it whatever they see, except for one thing. And that is, it's clearly, or many people say it's clearly, it clearly carries with it the idea that if you are opposed to Israel, if you are opposed to Zionism, you are therefore anti-Semitic. That's clearly embedded in it. And as many people say, and I certainly say, and I firmly believe, you can be opposed to Zionism, you can be opposed to policies of the state of Israel without being anti-Semitic. That is for certain. What's regrettable is that the IHRA definition has been widely adopted. I say it's regrettable, but I think the adoption on the whole is meaningless. I mean, governments have adopted it, including the government of Canada. Football clubs have adopted it. Airlines like Lufthansa have adopted it. Villages hither and thither have adopted it. It used to be an easy thing to do, and it was regarded as sort of the litmus test. If you adopted the IHRA definition, you were good, you were fine, you had shown that you were not anti-Semitic. But now I think the pendulum is swinging. More and more people are looking at that definition and saying, no, no, no. First of all, this is not a good definition. It's largely meaningless. And secondly, to the extent it has meaning, it can be used as a cudgel to beat people who want to criticize the state of Israel, and that's a bad thing. So, for example, the Canadian Association of University Teachers, you may well be a member, I don't know, there are 70,000 members of the CAUT. They quite recently repudiated the definition and said that many Canadian universities have been trying to shove it down the throat of their staffers, their professoriate, and they were opposed to that. So I think it's a bad definition, it's not helpful, and it can be used badly.
Well, and presumably its potential popularity is diminished by what's happening in Israel right now, where you have about half the population protesting against the policies of the current right-wing government of Israel. Does that, by that definition, arguably they could be interpreted as being anti-Semitic?
Yeah, I think Jim, you raised a very good point. I mean, people in the diaspora, in the United States, Canada, or elsewhere, Europe, seem to forget the fact that these policies, these kind of policies that you and I have just been talking about, are very controversial in the state of Israel. There are many highly organized, highly articulate, powerful groups opposed to these policies. No one describes them as being anti-Semitic. Although, having said that no one describes them as anti-Semitic, they do come under big fire from the right-wing Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jewish community.
Yeah, but nevertheless, I mean, I've often been struck over the last decade or so that there are columnists in Haaretz and other Israeli newspapers that, were they to write similar columns in the Toronto Star or the Globe and Mail, would be called anti-Semitic, and the newspaper would be condemned for allowing them to express their views. I've just been struck by the disparity between what actually happens in Israel and what's tolerated in North America.
I think that's a very good point. A good example of the fact that many Jews are opposed to the IHRA definition is the so-called subsequent Jerusalem Declaration, which covered much of the same ground. It was a declaration issued by 200 or 300 Jewish professors and intellectuals, not just in Israel, but many of them in Israel, which essentially repudiated the IHRA definition and tried to come up with something more precise and less political.
Could you try to characterize how that definition approaches anti-Semitism?
Well, it has many, I think, the same flaws of the IHRA. Let me back up. Anti-Semitism is very hard to define. I mean, when you really get down to what exactly is it? Being critical of Jews for being Jews, being critical of what Jews do or what you think they do, being critical of the policy, what is it exactly? And I don't think anybody has been able to deal with this satisfactorily. I mean, it's easy to define it if you say anti-Semitism is attempting to kill Jews who had one Jewish grandfather. That's easy. But fortunately, we're not in that world now. Hopefully we'll never be in it again. So it's a very hard thing to define, and all these attempts to define it flail around, end up with an unsatisfactory definition. But the Jerusalem Declaration, I think, tries to be more precise, more legally correct, more well-defined. But again, ultimately doesn't help all that much.
Partly, though, the difficulty in defining what is anti-Semitism is something you address in another way in the book, and that is how everything from attempting to kill Jews to various microaggressions get treated as all manifestations of the same thing. Could you talk a little bit about that? And
Yes.
you know, you make clear that there are some problems with that approach.
Yes, I do. I mean, I think that first, you're right in what you say. There's a tendency to treat any kind of attack or criticism or anti-Jewish activity, anti-Jewish expression thing, whether it's trivial or not trivial. It's all lumped together and treated as one thing. I think this is very unhelpful. Let me just say also this, to some extent, some people won't like this, but to some extent I see kind of almost an international industry dedicated to gathering together all and every expressions of anti-Jewish sentiment or any anti-Jewish activity, gathering, cataloging it, counting it, issuing reports, so-called statistics of how many incidents have taken place. It's commonplace to do that. Many organizations, including in this country, in Canada, issue, like B'nai B'rith, for example, issue annual reports on the number of anti-Jewish incidents in the country. My point would be, Jim, is that not all incidents are equal. There are serious ones and not so serious ones. And it's very important to be precise and be discerning so that you can respond in a proportionate way. So, as you know, I suggest in the book a typology of 4 kinds of anti-Semitism. The first kind is what I call degradation anti-Semitism. Another word would be uncivil anti-Semitism. And this is what most of these so-called incidents comprise. Somebody yelling, for example, dirty Jew as you walk down the sidewalk, or scrawling a swastika on the side of your house. That's actually happened to me. That sort of thing. Very unpleasant, not justifiable, not to be condoned, and whatever we can do to stop it should be done, but not exactly the Holocaust. Even though some people would say that's how Holocausts begin, with activity like that. But I would say that kind of anti-Semitic activity needs to be seen for what it is. And although unpleasant and uncivil, it's not catastrophic. The next level of anti-Semitism in my typology is violent anti-Semitism. That's when somebody doesn't just yell dirty Jew at you as you walk down the street, but a couple of thugs beat you up. That's an entirely different kind of thing. That's obviously a matter for the intervention of the state. That's a matter for criminal law. That's a matter for the police and so on. Now, regrettably, not every country has a robust legal system with an independent judiciary, not every country has a system that we can rely upon to deal with those kinds of things. But that's the next step. The third step is what I call private institutional anti-Semitism. And that's when organizations like, for example, a club bars Jewish members, or universities discriminate against Jews in the application process, or newspapers have a clear anti-Jewish editorial policy, those sorts of things. But no violence is involved, but these are organizations, these institutions being anti-Semitic. And then the final level, which is the worst kind, which is the catastrophic level, is public institutional anti-Semitism. And that's when anti-Semitism gets incorporated in government policy or in the platforms of political parties. And that requires a very robust, all-out defense to try and deal with it. But I think if you think of these 4 kinds of anti-Semitism, then you come to think of a proportionate response. How do we deal with each one? What is the appropriate response to this escalating typology?
You address, though, I think, in the book, some of the rationale that others would use to say, no, we have to treat them all as serious. And that is the experience of the Holocaust and people saying, well, this trivial thing, this microaggression left unaddressed can lead to the catastrophic.
Yes, I think that's true. I think two things. I mean, for example, Daniel Goldharden, in his extraordinary book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, which is an extraordinary and I think much praised but also controversial book, makes the point that in Nazi Germany, what I would call degradation anti-Semitism, the speaking poorly about Jews, sort of laid the groundwork for a kind of a process that then was made possible. So there is that danger. One form of anti-Semitism, although you might regard it as not terribly consequential can lead to other forms that are consequential. So that's one point. And then the other point is, of course, people always say, well, this is how these terrible pogroms and so on begin. They begin this way. There's always the possibility that these presage something else more serious. These will lead to something more serious. So I like to quote the great author Stefan Zweig, who wrote about how in Vienna, in Austria, in the 1930s, people were watching what was happening in Germany, but they said, that's just Germany. We don't have to worry about that. We all know where that led. Right. So this is what you can anticipate. You don't know. You don't know how one thing leads to another, or if indeed it will lead to the other. So I take your point, but I still would maintain that to treat all kinds of anti-Semitism as if they're equal to all other kinds of anti-Semitism is to muddy the waters, is to undermine the whole concept, and to create difficulties that we don't need.
Yeah, causing people to stop. I mean, like Chicken Little, the sky is falling. You just people stop listening to complaints about the serious versions of it that have to be addressed in society.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, in many areas of public policy, including in areas relating to free expression, your specialty, there are distinctions that have to be made. There are gradations. We hone in. We try and be very careful about recognizing what we're dealing with, and then that way we assess its importance in a meaningful way, and we can deal with it accordingly.
As long as we're talking about the definition of anti-Semitism, perhaps we could explore some of your thoughts about the relationship of anti-Semitism to Zionism.
Well, that's a very thorny subject indeed.
Yes.
I mean, so much of modern anti-Semitism, I think, is caught up with the politics of the Middle East. So much of anti-Semitism is derived from or is connected to the views that people have about Israel, including the creation of the state of Israel in the first place, and Israeli policy since 1948. I mean, so much of modern anti-Semitism in various ways drives off what's been happening in the West Bank, for example, the settlement of now some 700,000 or maybe more than that now, Jews in the West Bank. So it's driven off policies of the Israeli government. So some people, including very famous people like Nelson Mandela or Desmond Tutu, have described Israel as an apartheid state because they look at the treatment of the Palestinians primarily in the West Bank and in Gaza, but primarily in the West Bank, or they did. Both those great men are now regrettably dead. And they would say, well, here's a case where Palestinians are being treated, and indeed they are, this is undeniable, as second-class or third-class citizens, and that is just simply not acceptable. So people who say that, people who are far less eminent than Nelson Mandela or Desmond Tutu, are very quickly, very often labeled anti-Semitic. Now, one example, many people will probably disagree with this, but one more modern example was Jeremy Corbyn, who was leader of the Labour Party of the UK and could have become prime minister, although he didn't, and was anti-Zionist. I mean, he criticized what Israel did along the lines, let's say, of Mandela or Tutu and many other people who disagree with Israeli policies. He was labeled an anti-Semite. That pretty much led to the destruction of his job as the leader of the Labour Party. And even that reverberates even now with the Labour Party periodically, with Keir Starmer, the current leader, periodically insisting that the Labour Party is not anti-Semitic, insisting that various members of the Labour Party who may have made comments about Israel or Israeli politics are not anti-Semitic. But to me, that was entirely wrong-headed. Again, as I said earlier, there's a big difference between being truly anti-Semitic, whatever that means, which is, we talked about that earlier, and being opposed to some policies of the state of Israel, particularly given what some of those policies are.
But as you said in the earlier part of this conversation, increasingly the claim of anti-Semitism is linked very much to one's views of or comments on Israeli government policies, or some of the people who are most attacked as anti-Semites in North America are people who support the BDS movement, for example. I don't know if you have any comments about that.
Well, the BDS movement is not.
Actually, I'm sorry, could you explain just to the audience what BDS is, perhaps?
Yeah, the BDS movement stands for boycott, divest, what's the S part? Sanction, boycott, divest, and sanction. And it's a movement that was started, not surprisingly, I suppose, I think principally by academics.
Yes.
That said, given the policies of the state of Israel, to which they were opposed and for all kinds of reasons, which we know more or less, that Israel should be boycotted. People who have assets of some kind or other in or connected to Israel should divest themselves of those assets, and Israel should be sanctioned. Well, it never really picked up much steam. I think it was mostly confined to the common rooms of university faculties, but it's still sort of floating around out there as a movement. Now, by the way, the Jerusalem Declaration, which you talked about before, you asked me some specifics, explicitly excludes BDS from the purview of anti-Semitism. Oh. It says, you can support BDS without being targeted or tagged or described as an anti-Semite. It's a very complicated thing, but it's hard to sort out the kind of geopolitical aspects of what's happening in the Middle East in connection with Israel from these things like anti-Semitism. I mean, a number of people, for example, have made the comment, and I talk about this in my book, that really the dispute in the Middle East between Palestinians and Jews is not really a religious dispute. It's not really an ideological dispute. It's really about land and politics. The Arabs and the Palestinians and the Jews are not, I don't think, dedicated to the destruction of each other, despite the fact that sometimes some hotheads on either side say that. They've just got themselves into a really thorny mess, and it's not obvious what the way out is, but it's not about religion, it's not about ideology, it's not even about really fundamental hatred, it's about land.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you see some of the peculiar positions, from my point of view, taken by the Israeli or the current Israeli government and Netanyahu previously as well, where there are countries like Hungary and Orban who are, by my view, pretty anti-Semitic, who are close allies of Israel, or some of the partnerships that they've made with the UAE and other certain Arab states that again have a history of anti-Semitism and yet are embraced by the Israeli government. So it would suggest that even the Israeli government's notion of anti-Semitism is tied in with political aspects. I don't know if...
Well, yeah, I mean, politics, particularly international politics, make strange bedfellows. I mean, some of us are old enough to remember that one of the regimes that supported Israel during the 1967 war was the apartheid regime of South Africa, which sold arms to Israel. So once you get to that kind of elevated geopolitical level with these various so-called leaders strutting around on the world stage, ideology doesn't often seem to count for very much.
Right. The subtitle of your book talks about identity politics. Could you talk a little bit about understanding anti-Semitism in the context of identity politics? Yes,
I mean, you've read the book, Jim, so you know I'm no fan of identity politics, which I basically regard as something that is a breeding ground for division and hatred and prejudice, because what it really does, certainly in its purest form, is pit one group of people against another group of people. I espouse the view that what we should be doing, all of us, all the time, is finding the things that we have in common, not the things we have that differentiate us each from the other. So when it comes to anti-Semitism, what I say in the book is, on the whole, anti-Semitism identity politics has been a very bad thing for the Jewish community. Now, why is that? I think there are three reasons, really. The first reason is it's inherent in identity politics, and I discuss this at length in the book. I won't go through all the details now, but groups tend to be very critical and suspicious of other groups.
Mm-hmm.
Groups tend to take the position that only if you're a member of their group can you really understand what it's like to be a member of their group? And by the way, their group has historically been disadvantaged, been aggrieved, not been understood, et cetera, and now has to try and redress that. So that creates an atmosphere, and it's a worldwide atmosphere, where criticism of people, attacks on people, is a much more accepted, much more acceptable than they were, I think, before. And therefore, paradoxically, strangely, it's easier to be an anti-Semite. It's easier, more acceptable to be an anti-Semite in some ways than it was before. So that's the first reason. The second reason is, it's really, in a way, another expression of the first, is identity politics emphasizes, the concept of the other. This is, again, a way of saying it emphasizes differences. The Jews, it doesn't have to be just Jews, are the other. They're different, they're separate, they're apart. They're not to be given perhaps the kind of opportunities, they're not to be given the kind of respect that we should have. And then the third point is that, a long-term ambition or tactic or strategy of Jewish communities in various places that they found themselves in the world, all over the world, was to try to assimilate in the broader community. In order to become, so for example, French Jews wanted to become as French as anybody. German Jews wanted to become as German as anybody, wanted to be accepted by the broader community, wanted to assimilate into the broader community. The trouble with identity politics is, from that point of view, is there is increasingly no broader community. We're all in our own little silos. The idea of a big, broad, general community into which people could assimilate is pretty much dead. Now, I would say parenthetically that the Jewish tactic of assimilation didn't work very well historically. So it was a big mistake. It was certainly the case that they tried very hard, but it didn't work out very well. The attempts to assimilate in France were capped by the Dreyfus case. We all know what happened in Germany and Austria, and of course in other countries. So on the whole, identity politics, in my view, is bad for the Jewish community, with one exception, as I said, and that is Jews have become much more, I think, understandably, and even so, much more aggressive, as we discussed earlier, in identifying anti-Semitism, repudiating it, lashing out against it, themselves becoming aggressive and critical. And that's all part of the ethos of identity politics. So in a sense, they've been given permission to be like that. I think that's not healthy, that's not good for the Jewish community or anybody else. But that seems to be what's happened.
Do you see a continuity between the kind of nationalism that we saw in Nazi Germany that we're seeing in Hungary today and identity politics?
Yes, I'm not sure it's nationalism, Jim, so much as I would say more populism. But of course, populism is connected with many big national movements. You mentioned Viktor Orban, populism there. We all know about populism in the United States, and so on. And I think what happens with populism is, again, it's a breeding ground for example, for conspiracy theorists. Populists love conspiracy theories. So we've seen, every day we pick up the newspaper, we see that. And of course, they're always looking for somebody who's conspiring to undermine the state or looking to undermine their particular group through devious and horrible and illegal and immoral ways. So that naturally feeds into the whole anti-Semitic, movement, if that's what it is. But nationalism, again, this was what led Theodor Herzl to propose the idea. It wasn't entirely original, though it was largely original in the 19th century, of the creation of a state for Jews, because that was the era of nationalism in the 19th century. Everybody was a nationalist. Everybody wanted to create their own state in the land that they had. The trouble was the Jews didn't have any land, so they didn't have that essential thing needed to create a national state. So they went on the search for land and they found it.
Well, and certain versions of nationalism, which also are populism, are linked to a homogeneity of the population. So I think in Hungary, well over 90% of the population is identified as ethnically Hungarian, and that feeds into how I think the rise in anti-Semitism a Jew can't qualify as a Hungarian in that view, in the same way that we saw a version of that in Nazi Germany.
I think that's right. There's another interesting point here too, Jim, and that is, one's almost reluctant to introduce this concept, and that is, where does democracy fit into all of this?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a very interesting book about anti-Semitism in Europe by Gozali. I mentioned it in my own book, which he makes the observation that in Italy, what made he was primarily concentrating on Italy, what made anti-Semitism more and more possible in the 20th century was the rise of democracy. Because all of a sudden, people who never had a political voice,
right?
These were people who were not very well educated people, not very discerning people, but people who had never had a political voice suddenly had it. And that when that happens, the question is, well, how do they use their political voice? This is also part of populism in a way. How do they use it? If they don't like Jews, they may well use their political voice to try and introduce various anti-Semitic measures. So there's a connection there too to the rise of democracy.
Well, and it's the point you develop early on in your book. You quote Ali as saying, well-intentioned educational policies and state-supported desires to lift the masses socially, both of which can be counted among the 20th century Europe's greatest triumphs, serve to increase hatred. The same is also true of the best political ideas and those most deserving of continuation: democracy, liberty, popular participation, self-determination, and social equality. It reminds me of a fairly recent book by two political scientists in the United States who talk about the paradox of democracy and the very kind of fundamental commitment to an ongoing public discourse makes genuine democracy possible. It also makes the rise of the biggest threats to democracy possible.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this idea you've just expressed very well. This idea is the idea that keeps me up at night. The idea that somehow democracy, which we all feel wedded to, in a country like Canada, we all, I think, one way or another, pretty much all of us are committed liberal Democrats, small L, liberal Democrats. We believe in it. We think it's the best form of government on the one hand, but on the other hand, we have to acknowledge that it puts political power in the hands of people who perhaps cannot or can put political power in the hands of people who cannot be trusted with it, who are not competent to exercise it, and who can be dangerous. So what do you do? How do you reconcile these two things? I don't know. And if you ever discover it, Jim, please call me and tell me what the answer is.
Well, I haven't discovered it, but I actually have a thought about it. And it's partly that democracy should not be understood as something you achieve, but as a process. And for it to be a genuine democracy, it has to bring in as much of the population as possible in a meaningful way, not just in a way a libertarian would say, where everyone theoretically has the possibility of being engaged, but not really. And there has to be a commitment to informing and engaging. So understanding it in that way, I think, gives some possibility of continuing to develop it, so it is a more genuine reflection of the better sides of ourselves.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, even though I'm pretty ancient now, I still have a certain naivete when it comes to these issues. And I still like to think that a key to all of this in a country like ours, and there are other countries like ours, fortunately, is education. I mean, if people receive a good education, the right kind of education when they're young, they will understand things later on that they may not understand otherwise. So, I mean, to me, the education is very, very key to all of this. And one of the things I often like to quote was what a smart man once said to me, which he said, you know, Philip, he said, the best answer to a bad argument is a good argument. And that is true. The best answer for ignorance is facts, is truth. So these seem kind of, utopian or idealistic or silly precepts, but I'm not sure they are. I think that they carry a lot of weight. And I would like to see, for example, just give one precise example, I would like to see much more emphasis in the schools in this country on serious civics courses. So people understand how this country is run and governed and how it can be influenced and what's the right way to go about it. So people don't show up in trucks in the nation's capital and demand that the governor general and the Senate intervene when it comes to mass mandates. So people don't do that because they understand that that's not how the thing works. So I think civics, the emphasis on good arguments, the emphasis on facts, the emphasis on good education is very important. And that brings us to social media, if you want to discuss
Well,
that.
before we get to social media, because that is where it brings us, but before we get there, education, I mean, I agree with you that we really do need more and better education, but I'm not sure that's enough. I spent a lot of my life in the university, as you did, and then I left and spent a good deal of my life in the trade union movement. And I never found that highly educated people had necessarily better politics than ordinary working class people. I found just as many bright and interesting people in the trade union movement as I ever found in the university world. I think the other element in addition to education is the public's right to know things. We have all sorts of limits on our public right to know. I mean, totally, I'm not talking about right to know by going to university or college, but also Canada has the worst whistleblower protection legislation in the world. The International Bar Association did a study of whistleblower protection legislation, and Canada was at the bottom of the list. So whistleblowers are one of the ways we learn things. There's limits to press freedom in Canada, quite serious ones. We have middling access to information legislation. There's all sorts of ways in which the public can come to know things that are being degraded.
Well, I agree with that up to a point, but I discussed some of these issues in my last book, Nothing Left to Lose, about freedom in Canada. I mean, you mentioned, for example, the press.
Right.
I deeply regret the large virtual disappearance of traditional press.
Right.
Traditional investigative reporting, curated, and all of that, which is largely gone now for a variety of reasons. I think
the biggest reason is Google and Facebook, which have sucked up.
You're right. You're right. But Google and Facebook and Twitter are no substitute for a first-class curated newspaper not afraid to do investigative journalism. Those people, the fourth estate, were vital to the kinds of things you were talking about: the transparency of government, the understanding of government, the education of the people about how the country is being run. That's largely gone now, I think, unless tell me if I'm mistaken.
Oh.
Twitter is no substitute.
Well, I think there are at most 4 or maybe 5 media outlets in Canada that have a serious investigative journalism arm.
Right.
And it's because their business model has fallen apart as all the advertising dollars flow into Facebook and Google. So here we are in in social media by a different door.
We were bound to end up there, Jim.
So why don't you share a little bit about your thoughts on social media and anti-Semitism?
Well, I've wrestled with this quite a bit. This whole question is very broadly put, are social media a good thing or a bad thing?
Right.
In my last book, Nothing Left to Lose, I tended to come down on the bad thing side of things because so much misinformation, so much stupid opinions, trivial opinions are expressed and often gain ground, often gain momentum on social media. How could this be a good thing, particularly if you compared it to traditional reporting as we just discussed and described? But upon further reflection, and I've somewhat changed my view, as expressed in this new book on anti-Semitism. And of course, it's a big subject in anti-Semitism because typically the anti-Semitic warriors, those fighting against anti-Semitism, decry social media, where anybody pretty much can go on with any kind of ridiculous anti-Semitic claim or criticism that gets retweeted and all the rest of it and can gain a lot of ground. There's ample evidence that does in fact happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the anti-Semitic warriors are on the whole pretty much either down on social media in general, or will advance big arguments for strict regulation of it. Right. I don't agree with that. I might have agreed with it if you'd asked me 3 or 4 years ago, but I don't agree with it now because I've kind of thought about it some more. I think that freedom of expression is an essential, enormously valuable attribute of a country like ours, of a genuine liberal democratic state. I think even applies to social media with all its horribleness. So we all know what that horribleness is. And any attempt to regulate it is very dangerous. Now, I do agree, of course, that there are some kinds of free expression that are not acceptable. You know, to use the old the old thing that the law professors like to say, you can't stand up in a crowded theater and shout fire, right? You can't incite people to violence. In fact, that's a criminal offense. You can't do things like that on or off social media. So there are some outer limits on freedom of expression. And I don't think anybody would disagree that's highly desirable. But within those outer limits, I think you have to let it take its course. And then I come back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, which is if somebody puts rubbish up on Twitter or Facebook or some other social media, the right response is not to shut them down, to cancel their account, to throw them in jail, to fine them or whatever. The right response is to make clear that what's gone up is rubbish and let people form their own conclusions. It's the old best response to a bad argument is a good argument. Best response to misinformation is truth. Now that can be a hard road to hoe. That can be an exhausting business, right? I mean, that can really tire you out running down that road. That's the road I think we have to run down. So all these attempts to regulate social media, some of them so-called voluntary, so Facebook will voluntarily do something or other to moderate or curate or something, or post on Facebook, or that's bad enough, but much worse is government attempts to regulate. Once the government starts saying, yes, you can post that, no, you can't post that, once that principle is established, once that's seen as okay, then where does it stop? Particularly when it comes to anti-Semitism, when, as we were discussing earlier, some people think it's anti-Semitic to criticize Israeli government policy, others don't.
Well, so our Prime Minister apparently does because he's endorsed the IHRA statement.
Yeah. I mean, if the government of Canada came along and said, oh, well, Mr. Turk, we see you posted something on Twitter criticizing Israeli occupation of the West Bank, so we're canceling your Twitter account and we're going to regulate the hell out of you because that's anti-Semitic, that's not acceptable. That, to me, is we're in serious trouble once that kind of thing starts happening. So I think, to me, the best thing to do is to err on the side of, I'm not sure what it is, but not to respond to these cries, to attempt, except in the very most basic kind of way, to regulate content. That means there'll be a lot of junk on social media, but hey, there's a lot of junk there anyway. So,
well, if we look back at the last transformational means of communication with the invention of the printing press, there's some interesting writing about how it led to a significant rise in anti-Semitism as anti-Semitic views were able to be dispersed more effectively. And it took almost 100 years to sort out how to deal with that. And I have the sense we're in a similar period now where our dilemma is, I think, as you were saying, everything that's good about the internet in the sense of giving people who historically have not had voices a voice, allowing dissidents in Saudi Arabia or Russia or Iran to speak because of the anonymity of the internet and the encryption protects them. All the good things about that are also the things that permit all the bad things to happen. And we haven't figured out a way we can regulate the bad things without eliminating the good things. And our federal government is in the throes of the dilemma over that because there's widespread demand for doing something about all the terrible stuff that's on the digital platforms, the disinformation and the hate and so forth. And our Prime Minister promised he was going to have legislation within 100 days of the last election. I don't think they have a clue how to do that without causing equal harm by their regulation, other than the things that are clearly illegal already.
I would point out that this rubbish in the media is not a new phenomenon. I mean, there were all kinds, to some extent, still are ridiculous tabloid newspapers around, that are hardly edifying when it comes to content. I mean, recent scandals in the UK and perhaps elsewhere, but I'm thinking more of the UK, have shown the lengths or depths to which people who run these tabloid newspapers will go to dig up dirt on people, to vilify them, often unfairly and unjustly and inaccurately. But this is not a new phenomenon, but it's been turbocharged by the wide availability.
That's right.
And anybody now has a publishing platform available to them. Anybody. Some of them are junky platforms, but some, I have no particular brief for Substack, but take Substack. Anybody for nothing can start a Substack thing going and publish their views to the world.
Mhm.
Now, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? I mean, it carries with it, obviously, the fact that a lot of ignorant, prejudiced, silly, pointless views will be expressed. It was always thus, I would say, but even so. But our job, yours and mine and the citizens of this and other countries, is to identify that for what it is and discard it accordingly. But some of the stuff that's published will be important and compelling and will be published by people who never had a voice before. Now
That's
they have
right.
a voice.
I mean, the opportunities it provides for people in marginalized communities who've been denied access to any means of publishing their views.
And that's a wonderful thing. That's a wonderful thing.
Exactly right. Exactly right. You in later chapters in your book, you talk about, you have a chapter, I think it's called Jews and Muslims. Can you share
Yes.
some of what you had your thoughts on in that section?
Well, I mean, the book, although it's not a particularly long book, covers a lot of ground.
It does indeed.
There's a chapter on Jews and Muslims and Jews and Christians. And I think the point of those two chapters is really, well, when it comes to Jews and Muslims, is to make the point that people tend today, in the modern geopolitical context, to just assume that Jews and Muslims or Jews and Arabs are pitted one against the other, they're mortal enemies, and was always that way. Well, it's just not true. In fact, as I discuss in the book, for a long time, the Ottoman Empire was very receptive to Jews moving to the Ottoman Empire. For example, most of the Jews who were expelled from Spain in the latter part of the 15th century were taken in by the Ottoman Empire, some in what is now Turkey itself, many in North Africa. That was the foundation of the North African Jewish community in Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. And they were, on the whole, well treated. Now, it's true they had second-class status as citizens. Nonetheless, they were well treated. Many of them rose to be to important positions of power and influence in business and even in government. So there isn't a long-standing, bitter, dangerous hostility between these two communities, something that's often assumed now, should not be assumed. I mean, one should look at the history and recognize that there's a lot of affinity, theological, philosophical, and even historical affinity between these two communities. And that I take to be a good thing. That I take to be the possible basis for some kind of reconciliation emerging out of the current geopolitical trouble. So that's part of what I talked about in that chapter. When it comes to Christianity, that's a more...
Yeah, I mean, you have a short chapter on Jews and Christians, which I found very interesting in the contrast to Jews and Muslims.
Well, my basic point is, I'm not sure that it's music to everybody's ears, but my basic point is that historically, the attitude of Muslims to Jews has been much better than the attitude of Christians to Jews. I mean, it began with the historically inaccurate claim of Jewish deicide. I mean, the Jews didn't kill Christ, but they've still been accused of it and still are accused of it, these many years later on. And many people have argued, many serious scholars have argued, and very persuasively, that those kinds of views in the Christian church and the attitude of the Christian church, if it didn't lay the foundations for the Holocaust, it certainly didn't stand in the way of the Holocaust. So there's a association between these views and the terrible slaughter of Jews in Europe. So, I mean, it's probably to some extent a facile conclusion, but the conclusion I come to is, the Muslims are not necessarily the enemies of the Jews. It wasn't always that way. In fact, as I said, philosophically and theologically, there's a lot of similarities. Maybe more so the Christians than the Muslims.
But you also cite a Pew survey that was done in the United States, where the Jewish community in the United States seems to recognize what you're just saying. Yes. As I recall, it said that it found that roughly 40% of Jews actually saw some positive aspects or potentially positive aspects of relations with Muslims. 0% or virtually 0% found positive aspects of relations between Jews and fundamentalist Christians.
Yeah, it's very strange, Jim. And then, of course, in the United States, you have the whole evangelical Christian movement, which is huge. There's about 100 million Americans who describe themselves as evangelical Christians. And to them, Israel is a very important country. You know, it's an important part of the whole process of the end of days and all that stuff. Although, as people have pointed out, they can love and admire and be very interested in Israel without liking Jews. There's some evidence that that's the case.
Well, but isn't there also evidence?
Benjamin Netanyahu has
Yes.
said that the biggest supporters of Israel outside Israel are the evangelical Christians in the United States.
Yes, but if you look into the religious basis of their support, it's quite frightening, is it not? In the sense that they believe that the second coming of Christ will be preceded by a conflagration in the Middle East.
Well, that seems to be happening already. So maybe the second coming of Christ is to be anticipated.
Yes. Well, we've covered a wide range of things. I just want to remind the audience, if you have any questions for Philip or comments on what we've been talking about, please put them in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I haven't seen any come in as yet. Ange, do we have any questions as yet?
No questions yet.
Okay, well, I'll give another minute for that. I'm wondering if you know, I found your book, and I don't gratuitously compliment most authors because I don't find most books all that interesting. Yours is a small book. I found it incredibly rich in the range of issues you addressed and the subtlety and sophistication with which you addressed them. Are there aspects of the book that we haven't had a chance to talk about, or issues you raised in it that before we conclude that you'd like to speak to?
Well, I'd say a couple of things, just to sort of by way of conclusion. The first is, as you will have noticed as you went through the book, there's a certain sadness to some of it. I mean, the history of the Jews, which is so complicated and so disastrous in many respects, and so wonderful in some other respects, nonetheless, there's a sadness, and that which comes more to the fore in a couple of my last chapters. I mean, the Jews as wanderers over the face of the earth, which God knows they have been for a long time, to some extent still are. The Jews as a persecuted people, and all of that. You can't ignore that. You can't just wave that away. It's there. It has a huge influence. It's a big overhang over all this kind of discussion. The other thing that I would mention is a chapter that I think is perhaps interesting is are Jews superheroes? That question, because there is a kind of an idea many Jews have that Jews are the perennial victims. They've always been victims. They're still victims. They will continue to be victims. People will victimize them given the chance.
Right.
But my response to that is, okay, well, how do you square that with the following facts? About half the world's Jews approximately live in Israel, which, despite all its difficulties, is an immensely successful state economically. It's a huge regional military power. It has nuclear weapons. It regularly kicks the ass of surrounding Arab countries if they get in the way. So that doesn't sound like a whole bunch of victims to me. And so then you move to the diaspora. Most of the Jews in the diaspora live in the United States, about roughly 6 million or thereabouts. And you look at who are these people. Now, this is a vast generalization, of course, but nonetheless, in that group are some extremely talented people who run universities, run hospitals, have prominent careers in the public service, win Academy Awards, win Nobel Prizes. Now, there are those of us who haven't won Academy Awards and Nobel Prizes, but it's, again, the general impression you get, it's a very accomplished and impressive community. So where does the victim idea? Well, we know where it came from, but why is it still sort of on the table?
And
I don't know the answer to that. Well, Well, actually, that's not entirely true. I mean, it's part of the ethos. Somebody said, one of the writers, I think I may quote this in the book. Somebody said, Jews love it when people hate them, which is an interesting and provocative statement. And it ties in, of course, with what Jean-Paul Sartre said about anti-Semitism. He said anti-Semitism was what kept Jews together. It was absolutely essential to keep the Jewish community together, that the world was full of anti-Semites. So it's part of that ethos, I think, Jim, in a very kind of complicated sort of way.
Okay. Ange, one last, have any questions come in?
Yeah, a few questions have come in.
Okay, would you share the first one, please?
Jim asks, is it ever helpful to compare the discrimination faced by different groups? I'm worse off than that lot. I recall a conversation with someone saying they'd face less discrimination if they were of another marginalized group. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's an interesting observation. It's hard to kind of comment on it, really. I mean, anti-Semitism has often, in the United States, it's often been compared to discrimination against people of color. I think President Obama actually made this comparison. He said they were the two great racial hatreds in the United States, although somebody else said, yeah, but there's a difference. Anti-Semites, certainly in Nazi Germany, wanted to kill Jews, but people who are racists when it comes to people of color in the United States don't want to kill them. They just want to use them, manipulate them, and humiliate them. These are very hard kinds of comparisons to make. But yes, I'm sure that there are groups who are at least as much discriminated against, maybe even more. There might be people like those who are intellectually challenged, disabled people. I mean, remember that the Nazis didn't just go after Jews, didn't just put Jews in concentration camps. They put homosexuals in concentration camps. They put gypsies in concentration camps. They put people of intellectually challenged in concentration camps and use them for medical experiments. So, it's getting back to the general point I made earlier. Theodore Hazlitt said, everybody wants someone to hate. Everybody's looking for someone, as regrettable as this is, as horrible as this is, everybody's looking for someone to demean, to think is less than they are, to think should be made to serve them in some way.
Ange, do you have another question?
Yeah, the next question is from an anonymous attendee, and they're asking, how will the right-wing Israeli government affect global anti-Semitism?
Well, I think it will affect it a great deal. I mean, look, for example, to the United States, where I think which is the main international, as we know, of course, supporter of the state of Israel. And I think there's increasing pressure on the United States, and this is not maybe anti-Semitism in pure anti-Semitism, but there's increasing pressure on the United States to step away to some extent. And interestingly enough, the Jewish community in the United States, particularly the young Jewish community, is increasingly become disinterested, not uninterested, but disinterested in the United States, because they look at what's been happening in the West Bank, let's say, the policies of the US government, the Israeli government, the question you refer to, and then they put it in the context of Black Like Me and other movements of this kind. And they think, I can't support a state that has these kinds of policies. I wouldn't support it in my own country, and I can't support it in another. So again, it's complicated, but I think on balance, both within the Jewish community and outside the Jewish community, the current policies of the Benjamin Netanyahu government, and indeed of the Israeli government for some time, doesn't help one little bit.
Okay, Ange, do you have any more questions?
Yeah, there's another question. It's from Danielle. Danielle says, do you think Trump changed the game? Attacking the media and supporting paranoid conspiracy theorists was given daily media coverage. Do you think that having to argue against this kind of nonsense means that more people paid undue attention to it? Does this fuel anti-Semitism?
Well, I think that once you give the kind of presidential imprimatur to insane conspiracy theories, and some of them truly are insane, sure, you encourage other people, in a populist state, because Trump is a populist, you encourage other people to come up with their own conspiracy theories. Now, some will be about Jews and others will be about other groups. But yes, it's fuel for the flames. I mean, it's grossly irresponsible and dangerous government. and it adds fuel to all these flames that do, in the end run, do all of us a great deal of harm.
Well, I think, is there anything else you'd like to add before we end this? I want to talk a little bit about your book before we end, but is there anything else you wanted to raise that you?
No, I think it's been a very interesting and quite comprehensive discussion. Thank you, Jim. I appreciate it.
Well, I've enjoyed it very much. We did receive several questions related to your book and where people could get it. I just happen to have a copy here. I don't know if you can see it on your
Just
screen.
happen to have it. Well, you can get it in the
Antisemitism, an ancient hatred in an age of identity politics. And it should be in most bookstores, or readily available in independent bookstores as well as others.
Yeah, it's available in the usual places where you buy books. Yeah.
Yes, it's a relatively short book, but really rich in its analysis and its information, its references. I highly recommend it.
You may notice, Jim, that on the front cover, the publisher yanked a line from one of the blurbs on the back cover, which says something I can't quite read. It says something like, Philip Slayton, oh, there it is, one of Canada's boldest and most adventurous thinkers. So one of my friends rang me up and said, listen, I've got this book. And were you okay with the cover? I said, sure, I think it was fine. He said, well, it says here that you're one of Canada's oldest thinkers. You're not that old. I said, no, it's not oldest, it's boldest.
Well, listen, thank you very much for joining us today, Philip. I've really enjoyed our conversation. And I'd like to thank the audience for joining us as well. Each of the events that the Center for Free Expression puts on is posted, video of it is posted on its website the next day. And so a video of this, for those of you who have friends or others who you might like to have see Philip and the conversation, will be able to go there. In addition to putting up the video, we also put up resources related to the topic of the conversation that may be of interest to people who want to explore the issues that we've discussed today more fully. So along with the video tomorrow, will be posted some articles or videos or books, including the information about Philip's book that you might like to look into further. So again, thank you for joining us today, and best wishes. Bye-bye.
It's been a pleasure.